The speaker and the panelists for this afternoon's plenary will be introduced by Tom Bilodeau. Tom was born and raised in the dairy farms in Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin. He was trained as a lawyer at the University of Wisconsin, and he taught constitutional and labor law in Africa and practiced law in Wisconsin. In 1984, Tom was reborn as a Montanan and as a research director for the Montana Education Association. Since then, he has worked on school finance, bargaining, and human rights issues for MEA, excuse me.
Thank you, Chris. MEA and NEA are both very proud and pleased to be here today. Across this nation, 13,000 public school systems provide educational services for nearly 40 million American students. Every day in America's classrooms, 2.4 million educators daily confront the issues of the modern world. We are painfully and immediately made aware of both the promise and the problems that confront our society. We see the dysfunctional families, the poverty, a constricting economy, and discrimination. But we are also aware of how far we have come and how far we are yet able to go. We are also aware of what appears too often to be a very narrow-minded single-mindedness, a dogmatism that has overtaken American and Montana politics. It is a dogmatism and it is a threat to public education, a threat to that very core of values for which public education stands. America's and Montana's public education employees, all 10,000 of them within the state of Montana, tirelessly support, and we remain confident that America and this state will maintain its commitment to public education. Our confidence is grounded in our experience. As the RAND Corporation recently pointed out in an extensive study that they conducted on an historical basis of the sociology of the teaching profession, teachers, public educators in the nation and in Montana truly are the sons and daughters of America. The vast majority of public educators were born and raised in the families of wage-earning Montanans and members of the U.S. citizenry. The vast majority come from wage-earning families. They come from ranches, farms, and single-owner businesses. Far from being some alien elite, the majority of public educators are the first generation of their families to have ever received a college degree. They are, in many ways, the epitome of the American dream. They are the expression of those core values that we have held so dear to us for generations. We have not just observed the growth of the nation and our society, we have experienced it. We were part of the CIO organizing campaigns of the 30s. We were a part of the New Deal. We were also a part of the battlefronts and the home fronts of World War II and the Vietnam War. Here in Montana, we have also lived on the main streets of the small communities. We attend the churches, and we participate in the softball teams on the High Line. We are every bit as familiar with the wheat lands of the High Line as we are of the churches in Great Falls, as we are the mine shafts of Butte, as we are the tribal councils of the Blackfeet and Crow. Public educators were there in the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. We facilitated the integration of our schools. We walked with Martin Luther King. And in 1966, we merged the then largely white National Education Association to the largely black American Teachers Association. And we are here now, today in the 1990s, and at this conference, here participating in the continuing movement to a better society. We are here as this nation searches out a new path leading to single-payer health care for all. We are here in the post-war era struggling to develop some sort of peace-based economy that promotes the well-being of peoples throughout the world. And we are here in Montana searching for a way out of a budget crisis that has paralyzed our commitment to social values that we hold very near and dear and which are enshrined in our Constitution. We are confident that we will succeed, for there is no choice but to succeed. We are confident that we will move forward. It is our goal, it is our expectation that we will provide educational services for all 150,000 of Montana's students, regardless of color, regardless of their gender, regardless of their religious or national preference, regardless of sexual preference or other issues that have for too long divided us. We will do so because we must. We are very pleased to be part of this meeting today, of this conference of the last 2 days. I am very pleased to be able to bring to your attention and for you to hear today Ms. Judy Behnke from the National Education Association Center for the Preservation of Public Education. Judy comes here as a representative of the NEA, an organization of 2.2 million nationwide, a representation group that includes teachers and specialists and janitors and school secretaries and bus drivers from 52 affiliates across the United States, Puerto Rico, and overseas. Judy will speak to us about the experiences of the NEA at the national level, what the NEA has experienced in terms of its need to address an attack, a perceived and real siege on public education nationwide. Also today, we have 2 respondents from the Montana Education Association, MEA being a group, an organization representing more than 9,000 of Montana's 10,000 public educators in the state of Montana, also including within our ranks classified employees, the clerks, the aides, the bus drivers, the secretaries who also participate in the public education process. Our 2 respondents today for MEA are Dennis Carlson, born and bred in Montana, in Geraldine. You can't get much more Main Street than that. Dennis has taught in the public school systems of Montana for 17 years. He presently teaches and has for quite a few years been a local activist in the Huntley Project School District, just outside of Billings. He comes to us with a long experience with the Montana Education Association and is a leader in the Huntley Project Education Association. He is also a member of the MEA Board of Directors. Max Swan, the other respondent for today's address, was born in Missoula, and he has for the last 19 years taught in Polson. He is Montana's first recipient of the Krista McCullough Scholarship Award in 1987. He is a career-long MEA member, a local and state activist, who currently sits on the MEA Human Rights Task Force. He also serves on what is called the Montana Study Program, a nonprofit organization which brings Japanese students to study and to participate in Western Montana life. Without any further delay, I'd like to introduce and bring to your attention Judy Behnke from NEA.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. One of the things that Tom mentioned was that I have lived in Nebraska for 8 years before I went to Washington to work for the NEA 2 years ago. And when I arrived here yesterday afternoon and I was trying to get a sense of where I was and I drove around, I noticed a couple of things that I'm sure you cherish in this state greatly. One was the absence of noise. It was wonderful to drive and hear tranquility. And the other was the tranquility that space gives you, and the fact that because people have space, they tend to be very strong individuals. And I think that's an important aspect of part of what public education brings. I'm going to talk on two topics today, and hopefully we're going to have time for questions afterwards. The two topics are vouchers, which I think is pretty much the rage of the 80s and the 90s, and hopefully will not be the rage once we hit the year 2000. And the other topic I want to talk about is how the radical right or the far right impacts on government, which in fact are the public schools. I'm going to try to avoid the word religious right and Christian right, because I think that gives credence to an organization and a group of people that give them a better name than the kinds of activities that they have been doing on behalf of religion. So I'm going to call them what I believe they are, which are extremists. Let's talk. Now I have to tell you, I don't have children, so I don't have children in the public schools, but education is important to me. And for those of you who don't have children in the public schools, I want to give you a couple of things to think about why public education is important to all of us as citizens of this country. I'm an old civics teacher, and so when I get to give this kind of speech, it's one of my favorite things to do because it reinforces for me that all citizens should be active participation in the decisions the government makes. So let me just give you 4 essentials of public education. The first one is that public education is universally accessible and free to all students. 2, public education prepares individuals to become enlightened citizens who fully, I'm underlining fully, participate in our democracy. It's how our government works because we have this educated citizenry. 3, public education is publicly accountable through a nationwide network of school systems governed by locally elected boards of education and state legislatures. And finally, public education is designed to bring people of all races, creeds, and nationalities together rather than separate them. Those are the essentials that are at stake in this conflict that we're currently having with the radical right. Let me talk a little bit about vouchers first. First of all, let's define what a voucher is. A voucher is not school choice. A voucher is when public tax dollars are taken by private citizens and that money is given to a private or parochial school. That's the definition of a voucher for me. This concept has been around since the 60s. It was pushed heavenly, I guess is probably correct. It was pushed heartily and heavily by Presidents Reagan and Bush, but it failed at the national level, and there has been a vote on this in the Congress. What is happening now is because it did fail at the national level, it's beginning to come through the states and through the localities. There have been at least 4 states where there have been significant battles relative to vouchers. Let me name them and talk a little bit about each of them because they're slightly unique. First, Oregon and Colorado had balloted initiatives in 1992. In fact, they were tied into the federal races. They were defeated strongly by a 2-to-1 vote. However, the polling showed that before these initiatives began, but before people received information about them, that they were inclined to support the initiatives by a 2-to-1 vote. So information is a key participant in this system. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin had 2 other experiences. And let me talk a little bit about Pennsylvania. It's far away from you, but it's pretty close to where I live. In Pennsylvania, it came through the legislature, and both groups organized. It was one of the most difficult legislative sessions that the Pennsylvania people have ever experienced. Eventually, it was defeated, but here's what happened. Because it was defeated, and there was such a fine organization on the side of the voucher advocates, these people then went on to two other topics that impact on public education. The first that they took on was the concept of outcome-based education, in which, rather than measuring standards coming into a school system, schools are measured by what comes out of the school system. Are there tests? Are there things you can do to prove that you've learned these kinds of concepts? And this became such a political venture in the state of Pennsylvania that frankly they've reached a point now where I'm not sure that what they have is really worth anything, because it's going to be very difficult to measure. What happened after that was that the same person who organized the first part and the second part then decided that what they should do is to run stealth candidates for the local school boards. And so in the latter part of May of this year, the state of Pennsylvania had a major organizing through several of the religious movements to take over the school systems in Pennsylvania. And we're still not really sure how all that turned out. The other state that is quite different is the one that Tom's originally from, and I happen to have been from there too, and that's the state of Wisconsin. Now, the state of Wisconsin is unusual in this perspective. It has very specific constitutional law in place that says you cannot use public tax dollars for private schools that are affiliated with a religion, okay? Here's what happened in Milwaukee, and in fact, this, up until this summer, was the only place where vouchers actually are in place in the United States. A legislator by the name of Polly Williams introduced a limited private voucher system for the schools of Milwaukee only. And like many of these voucher proponents, her limitation was on low family incomes. So if you made a low income, you were eligible to receive a stipend from the federal government or from the state government to put your child in a private school as long as it was not church related. The system has been in effect now for 3 years. A professor at the University of Wisconsin, John Judy, has been assigned to study the project to see if in fact it makes a difference if low-income children are educated in private schools or in public schools. And at this point, Professor Judy has indicated there is no significant difference. Up until August of this year, that was the voucher activity. Now we have another Commonwealth that has placed the voucher initiative before the legislature, and it has passed. And that's in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. I don't know if you know much about their school system, but it's strange at best. It's a singular school system. They have local schools, but they really have not had much authority in the past. So it's been pretty much of a statewide system. And the government, the politics of Puerto Rico is such that one party is either in or the other party's in, and it's a winner-take-all kind of experience. So the other side won this last November, and as a result of that, we now have voucher schools or vouchers within the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. There have been 2 lawsuits filed on this, and one has been based upon the Constitution of the Commonwealth, and the other has been based upon the Constitution of the United States. So we'll see where we are. Now I'm sure you're saying, so what is this lady from Washington saying to me? And so does the NEA oppose private schools? No, we don't. Does the NEA oppose religion? No, we don't. Here's what our position is. We're not anti-religion. Rather, we are for the separation of church and government. Now, wish you would have been in my classes when I was teaching this. They never applauded this. Let's take a look at why that's so. You know, the framers of the Constitution were very religious people. One of the pleasures that I've gotten out of moving to Virginia is getting to read the Washington Post every day. And when it was Thomas Jefferson's, the anniversary of his 200th birthday, they had this wonderful article on Thomas Jefferson in the paper. And you know, when he ran for re-election, the biggest competition he had was the radical right. So they've been around a long time. But the framers of the Constitution, being the religious people that they were, wanted to make sure that the government never impinged on their rights to practice their religion, which is very important. So when you mix religion and government, and schools are government, you not only stand the chance of changing the schools, you also stand the opportunity of government changing your religious beliefs, which I think is very dangerous. Now, where's the big battle today? Well, it's not too far from you. It's in California, and a lot of us will view this as the Armageddon of the voucher issue. The fact is that the same people that brought the initiative petitions to Colorado are the same people that have brought the initiative petitions to California. Here's what they're voting on November 2nd. Just envision this. I have a hard time doing this. Maybe it's because of what I make for a living, but when I get over a couple of $100, the numbers are too big for me. The zeros are too long. So try to envision a school system of this size. You have 156,000 students in this state. The state of Colorado currently has 550,000 students in private or parochial schools. Now, here's what this initiative will do if it passes. First, it will give every one of those students who are already in private schools $2,600 of tax money. Secondly, let's translate that to all these zeros. What that means is that 1.3 billion, I'm not sure I know what that is, but $1.3 billion will be taken right off the top from public schools if no kid in the public schools ever decides to move. Now, secondly, what about standards? We all want high standards for our teachers. We want high standards for our students. Under this initiative, any person who can gather 25 kids together can start a school. You don't have to have certificated employees. You don't have to have a curriculum in place. You simply apply, and you are granted the 25 students times $2,600. When this issue first started in California, you'll recall the Waco, Texas David Koresh experience. And some of our California colleagues were saying, well, you know, it seems to me that David Koresh would be eligible to start a school if this legislation passes in California. And we talked about whether we should use that in the campaign, and we decided it was pretty bizarre, though it was true, and people would question whether this was so. Then this summer, a witches' coventry in California called a press conference and announced that they were for Proposition 174 because they were planning to start their own private school. So how far is how far? And finally, the worst part of this proposition is that it truly does take away the decision-making from those of us who care enough to vote every election. Because if, in fact, this legislation is passed, the only way it can be repealed is by a majority of registered voters voting to repeal. Now, do you know how difficult it is to get a majority of registered voters to vote, much less to get them to vote to repeal? So look for the television channels on November 2nd, because this will be the hot issue, I believe, of the state of California. Fortunately, the governor, who has really been sitting on the fence on this issue, has finally come out last week and said that he, in fact, opposes Proposition 174. Right now, we have signatures being gathered in South Dakota, Oregon, and Colorado again. So the issue continues on. There's been a new group formed in Washington last week called the American Alliance for Better Schools. This is a choice or voucher coalition. Let's take a look at what the goals of that group are. This is a little scary. We will build powerful, I'm quoting from their material, we will build powerful state political organizations in at least 25 states by the end of 1994. We will establish privately funded scholarship programs for low-income families in 15 major cities by July of 1994. And by the way, we have quite a few of those now, in case you hadn't thought about that. In Atlanta, in Indianapolis, in San Antonio, to name three, we have right-wing foundations who are giving money to low-income children to go to private schools. Their third goal, we will organize successful ballot initiatives in at least 5 target states by 1994 and an additional 8 target states by 1996. And finally, we will organize successful legislative initiatives in at least 4 target states for 1994 and an additional 8 states in 1995. One of the things that is unfortunate about all of this, although the discussion about public education is always good and it's always relevant, is the cost of these campaigns. The Teachers Association in California, for example, have assessed themselves $18 per person for 3 years to pay for this campaign in opposition to Proposition 174. That's about a $10 million campaign just for our side. And when it's all done, we haven't moved anything forward. We haven't moved a single positive thing for kids and for public education. Let me go now to the radical right. Let me define it for you. First of all, not all Christians are in this group. Not all fundamentalists or evangelicals are in this group. These are people, and this is my definition, these are people who wish to take their religious beliefs and force them on all society's segments by taking over government and having government reflect their beliefs. This is not religion, ladies and gentlemen. This is a political party. Now, if you question whether that's true or not, you need only to look to the National Republican Convention last summer to know the impact that the radical right is having on politics. And since that time, in at least 4 states, the radical right has in fact taken over the Republican Party in those states. So, how do they become a political movement? Well, let me give you a couple of pieces of information you may have heard yesterday, and I'll probably be repeating it. Let's take the Christian Coalition, headed by Pat Robertson. He currently claims 350,000 members of the organization, growing by 10,000 members a month. In addition, he claims 400,000 volunteers who are willing to work on behalf of the cause. So, how did this all come about that we're now on to schools? A couple of thoughts for you. First, in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president and George Bush wasn't, which meant that the thrust for the radical right shifted from the national level to the state and to the local level. Secondly, the group made a determination that schools should become the focus of their activity. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that the group feels that there has been a decline in the family. I think we would all probably agree with that. Why a decline in the family? They blame two groups, television and the public schools. Why school board races? Because of two things. It's the lowest political entry a person can make into politics. You talk to some of your congresspeople or your senators or your governor, and you're going to find most of these people have served on local boards of education. That's the beginning point of politics. And secondly, they have become involved in school politics because we have such a low voter turnout. So through the churches who organize every Sunday morning, they have the opportunity to put candidates out before the group without a large group voting. Now I'm sure you're saying to yourself, well, that doesn't really happen. Just let me tell you this little story. I talked to the president of the Lincoln Education Association not too long ago because the president of the school board was running for re-election. Pretty good person. Had opposition in the primary, won in the primary, and so was running unopposed in the general election. One day he received a phone call from a friend who said, hey, do you know that somebody's running against you? And he said, well, nobody could be running against me. I won in the primary. I'm the candidate. No, they're running a write-in candidate, and such church is doing this. The write-in candidate was exposed by the campaign to be a far-right person. And in spite of all of that exposure, still received 30% of the vote on election day as a write-in candidate. So there isn't any question that these people are organized. The person who probably does the best job of organizing them is Bob Simons, who is the head of the Citizens for Excellence in Education. There are 16,000 school districts, and this group is making a difference. They have run campaigns in San Diego County, California, where the majority of far-right people have been elected to some boards. And in the recent New York City elections, we have had a major impact on those school board races as well. And then the question is, does anything happen as a result of the election? Yes, it does. For one, some school districts are reinstating prayer. Others are back to an abstinence-only sex curriculum. Here's a test for you. Janet Jones, who is a professor out of the state of Washington, has said that there are 12 points that you should look at as it relates to your school district to see if you are susceptible to the far-right organizing in your school district. She says that if you get 6 out of 12, you better get yourself organized. So let me go over these. 1, your school system's policies and procedures for textbook adoption and material selection are vague and or outdated. 2, your school system has no statement about academic freedom. 3, parents and citizens don't participate in school activities. 4, there is little involvement between the school and the community at large. 5, voters don't turn out for school board elections and candidates must be cajoled to run. 6, there is little trust among the school board, administrators, and teachers. 7, your school system has no long-term plan or direction. 8, your teachers receive little public recognition. 9, your board does not follow its own policies, particularly when pressed by special interest groups. 10, your school board attorney is not familiar with current laws and special interest groups. 11, your community does not have a pro-school organization composed of community members or parents. 12, some of your community members belong to one or several of the national organizations of the radical right. So how'd you all do? Now, part of the argument is it comes down to the schools aren't doing what we think they ought to do. The schools aren't what they were when we went to school. and I'd like to address that. I'm 53 years old, in case you tried to figure out how old I am or how much I weigh, and I'm not going to give you the answer to that. And I want to tell you, both as a teacher and as a student, that the schools are not what they were when I was a student, and I'll bet you they aren't what they were when you were a student. When I was a student, the biggest problem was gum chewing and talking. I usually chewed the gum and did the talking, but now it's a total challenge to authority. It's drugs or it's violence. So do the schools have a drug problem? Yes, they do. And the reason that they do, folks, is because our schools are reflective of society's values. You don't bring kids to the schoolhouse door, drop them off at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, and have those children not reflect where society is today. So if the schools have these problems, society has these problems, and we all need to work on them together. In a recent Phi Delta Kappa survey, educators were asked to list what are the biggest problems you face in school today. Let me give you 4 of them. The first one was changing family values. The second was finance or funding. The third was society's problems falling on the school. And the fourth, a decline in confidence of the public schools. So, what is America to like today? Maybe not in this state, but let me say to you that there are 700,000 to 1 million homeless children in this country today. These kids live in shelters, they live underneath bridges, or they live in automobiles. Now, how can this not have an impact on these kids when they come to learn? Did you know that suicide is the 8th leading cause of death in the United States today, and that 7,000 of those suicides are between 15 and 24 years of age? The single parent is not an exclusive product of the cities. The harsh truth is that in many communities, the family is a more imperiled institution than the school, and that teachers are being asked to do what parents have not been able to accomplish. Not only do we expect our schools to educate, we also demand that they halt drug abuse, reduce teen pregnancy, end gang violence, feed and improve the health of the nation's young people, which from my perspective is one of the most bizarre experiences of observing the radical right, because these are people who don't believe you ought to have a free program for breakfast in the morning because it takes away from the family. And yet these kids, and many kids, it's the only balanced meal they have. In many urban communities, and I would suspect in some rural ones as well, schools are the only or one of the few stable institutions in a child's life. As the Nation at Risk report implied, our schools can rise no higher than the communities that support them. We've still not taken this lesson to heart. And this is probably educators' fault as much as it is anybody's, because we haven't communicated effectively the problems that we're having in school. Today, as in 1983, we have a system in which geographical location and local tax base, rich or poor, shape the educational destiny and life chances of our children. The result, in Jonathan Kozol's phrase, is savage inequalities. Every child in America is valuable. Every child can learn. 10 years after A Nation at Risk, it's time for the nation to begin to act on these truths. There's an old African adage that says, and if you get nothing else out of this speech, think about this: it takes an entire village to educate a child. And this is what must happen for schools to effectively respond today. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Next, we'll have Dennis Carlson speak as a respondent. Again, Dennis is from Huntley Project.
Afternoon. Several of the presenters that have spoken already at this conference have made reference to something called the defunding of public education. And people, I want you to know that it's happening here in Montana. The Nadelson petition to suspend the new income tax bill is a start. While a lot of Montanans may have signed the petition thinking that it would just block higher taxes for themselves, Nadelson's real agenda is the rest of the story that he didn't tell everyone. He is touting the idea of tuition tax credits to divert public schools tax dollars to schools of parental choice, which include private church-related schools and even home schools. Public schools are having financial problems as it is right now without having to give up more of their tax dollars. Nadelson and the people like him tell us that it will improve public schools, citing competition for students. Competition for students is something that our public schools in Montana aren't concerned with right now because our schools are overcrowded as it is. Our classrooms are full. Our teachers are dealing with numbers of students that they can hardly handle, and schools don't have funds to buy enough textbooks and supplies for the students they have. Is his goal really to improve public schools? I don't think so. His goal, I believe, is to destroy public schools, to do away with public schools. Conservatives have lambasted the public schools for several years now, saying that they are failing. William Bennett, made the statement in Newsweek magazine that Americans are getting dumber. Public schools are failing. Bennett knows quite a bit about failure. He failed as the education secretary, and he failed as the drug czar in the Reagan-Bush administration. If you watch a lot of the conservative news programs Sunday mornings, and whenever they talk about education or issues like this, they always have Bill Bennett on there to say his piece. Now some people are suggesting that he may run for president. Scary. During the Bush administration, a study was done that found that public education had improved a little, or was at least no worse than it was 30 years ago, with slight improvement in the math and science area. The study was kept under wraps by the Bush administration. They didn't want anybody to know about this study because at the time, George Bush was advocating his idea of choice schools in his America 2000 vision of education. Yesterday during the workshop that Dr. Capps conducted about understanding the theology of the Christian right, it was suggested that the fundamentalist movement in the past was non-political and unintellectual, and today it is becoming very political and very intellectual. I can attest to that. The enemies of public education have figured out that a major step in doing away with public education is to do away with the teachers' unions, namely the National Education Association and the Montana Education Association. These groups are coming under constant attacks for their policies and their resolutions. Critics claim that the unions block any and all attempts at real educational reform. They even suggest that teachers' unions work to increase teachers' salaries because dues are calculated by a teacher's average salaries, and the higher the salaries, the more money the association has to pay their highest elected officials. Hey, I'm an elected official. I'm an association president in my local, and I'm also elected to the Montana MEA Board of Directors. My association pay is the same as it was when I first started in those positions. That's $0.00. The NEA and the MEA are member-driven. Restructuring and reform to the NEA means teacher empowerment, teacher involvement, site-based decision-making. Who knows what is best for the education of children than the people who do it? It's like the commercial Pace Picante sauce is made in San Antonio by people who really knows what picante sauce is supposed to taste like. Who do you suppose knows better about the methods of teaching children than the teachers who actually do it? Is the public school system under attack in Montana? Yes, it is. It's sophisticated, and it's organized, and it's subversive, and it is succeeding. Public school teachers are having to deal with the social ills They are handed every day single-parent homes, no-parent homes, drug and alcohol abuse, physical abuse of children, sexual abuse of children, child neglect and hunger, and at the same time we're having to fend off attacks from the conservative right or the Christian coalition. We do have a tax revolt in our state at this moment, and it might not be too long before we also have a public employee revolt. Thank you.
Next, we have Max Swan, teacher from Polson. Mac will give us an insight into local association and local school board activities in that western Montana community.
Thanks, Tom. That's a big charge, offering insight. I don't know if I have a lot. I have a story, I guess, to tell, maybe a couple, and I'll try not to use all the time. I was told I was given about 5 minutes. The reason I got into this line of work is because I had a great high school teacher, and she came from Berkeley, California. It was her first year of teaching at Hellgate High School. I was a sophomore. She told me, you know, ignorance is really good stuff. It's great because you can change it. And I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic than a lot of the things that I've heard from the other people at this table today, and maybe even in some of the conferences. Although I'm not trying to say be complacent, but I guess I am given some hope by seeing people come to things like this, and I feel like there's a groundswelling of sort of the complacent middle, which is going to rise up and hopefully meet the extreme side head on. And I just see that this is just the beginning of that, and I'm encouraged. And so what I want to do is spend my time telling you a little bit about what's gone on in my school, and just from sort of the perspective of someone who just was fairly unaware of all of these larger issues of the Christian right and so on. Let me tell you a little bit about this place. If you've never been to Polson, it's in the northwest part of the state, just south of Glacier Park, about a couple hours drive. Polson's a small town. We have a population that's about 20% Native American. About 20 to 25% of the students live in poverty, the students I see in my class every day. There are about 1,500 students in that district, K through 12. And all these numbers are pretty ballpark. I just kind of figured them out, you know. When I figured out that a respondent doesn't just answer questions, they actually have to get up and talk. We have the reputation in Polson of having the lowest per student cost in a district its size. And the last time I can remember looking at that figure, it was about $2,900 per student per year. And we also have, as of last year, we had the lowest paid teachers and the highest paid administrator, head administrator, superintendent in the state, in schools that size, or one of the highest paid anyway. That role of the superintendent is vital in a district this size. The board members who come to bear on this operation that we call education, there are 5 of them. They're all volunteers. They don't get paid for that position. They're oftentimes caught in controversies. They come to that board with a number of different reasons for coming to that board, different skills and so on. I'll tell you a little bit about what I know about the board without trying to get into a libel case here. The head of the board is of our board, there are 5 members. The head of the board is a construction person. He builds houses. He employs 3 or 4 people in his business. There's a woman who is appointed to the board to represent the outlying districts for the high school, and she works in a meat processing plant and works kind of across the counter. It's the way that I've come to know her. There's a guy that runs a tire store in town, employs 5 or 6 people. He has an 8th grade education. There's a guy that ran a small t-shirt screen printing operation employed a couple people in his business. And then there was a court reporter that was elected to the board a couple of years ago, and he's our most conservative member. And he's the one that I think has some sort of tie into what maybe we've been talking about here over the last day and a half. He came to the board, I think, with a sort of an agenda of the schools were run, the schools were damaging to kids, the teachers were overpaid, that the curriculum was godless, and by God, that needed to be fixed right now. And as a result, he came on very strong at those board meetings and put forward a number of different suggestions. His current issue is eligibility for people on the athletic teams, and that is a whole other matter, I guess, but that's one of the things that he's involved in. As a result of some labor disputes last year, the local organization that I belong to, the Polson Education Association, got very active in electing one member to the board. And we all got together, there were 100 people on staff, we all got together and organized. We found someone who was willing enough, masochistic enough to take on that job. And she's a delightful woman. She has 2 degrees from MIT, one a master's and one a BA. She's philosophically well-grounded in what we think is important, and she was willing to run, and so we all worked very hard. And when the guy with the t-shirt operation quit, we managed to put her on the board. And she's been very effective in countering the court reporter guy who has his very conservative way of looking at things. And in effect, anytime he opens his mouth now at those board meetings, nobody really pays much attention. And so I guess the good news is just one little shot at the election, and if you can find someone who's willing to run, who's willing to speak out and say what they think, you can really put the kibosh on that ultra-conservative extreme viewpoint, and you can pull the center much back to where it ought to be, and really, I think, have some positive impacts. How am I doing for time, Tom? Do I have just a couple more minutes? I want to. That's the situation in Polson. I thought it was maybe helpful to just see how the board operates a little bit. And before I leave it, I want to mention one more thing. I've heard it said a number of times from Ken Toole and others this weekend that board is really important in the way that it affects curriculum and so on. I think that's a bunch of hogwash. I just don't see that happening. Basically, our board has for a number of years considered numerous times who's coaching the football team, who the head athletic director is, if the kids on the basketball team are playing enough minutes instead of sitting on the bench, that kind of thing. But they spend very little time discussing curriculum. That's really the province of the teachers in our school. And so I don't know how true that is. The idea of local control of boards of education is a great idea, and I think there are effective boards out there who actually deal with academic policy, but I don't think that's the board that I know, quite frankly. They seem very concerned with very narrow issues, and I think they're trying to be a policy board, but they really get caught up in micromanaging different parts of the school, and I think that from what I've heard, that's sort of the case across the state with school boards. And they get in trouble for it, and then they wonder why they're in trouble when they're supposed to be a policy board, but they don't really set policy and then let the administrators carry that policy out. Inside the schools, I thought I'd just give you a glimpse inside from my perspective, since I was given the opportunity to stand up in front of this microphone. I sort of like the negative, positive way of looking at things, because I think somewhere in the middle there's a truth. And here's the way that I see my high school. We're operating on a 19th century model that's really outdated. We're divided into 7 periods. I teach 5 different periods. Everything's divided into disciplines. And it's an antique model that doesn't work very well. I come out of the belly of this giant bureaucratic whale, and It's really hard to affect change, so I get very frustrated at that. I tend to be a sort of I guess I see myself as an innovator. I don't know if I am. But I think many teachers do, but they feel real frustrated by that bureaucracy that's around them, which is really unresponsive. And it's becoming more and more timid as administrators and school boards receive shots from wherever they're receiving shots from. There's a real strong public perception that the schools have failed, and I don't think that's true. I think that the mission has changed, and we're dealing with a whole different set of problems and really a whole different clientele. It used to be that it was okay to let people slip through the cracks, and if a kid didn't graduate, they'd survive in the outside world, they could get a job doing whatever. But now the mission has changed, and we're trying to graduate more people. Even with all the problems that we face at Polson High School, about half of our students go on to college. And I think that's remarkable given the kind of situation that we're faced with, shrinking resources and kids with all the problems that they bring to school. On the negative side, there are things like facing us like the school choice issue, which is, I think teachers see that as a real personal affront and attack. And there's a perception, a public perception that the schools are valueless, and I think that that's a crock. I think we teach values, and they're founded in the Constitution and the preamble and all those documents. The reality of schools is that teachers teach in isolation. You're frequently cut off from your college. You spend an enormous amount of time just with students. And that's the delight of teaching, and it's also one of the negatives sometimes. There's inability to find time to bring about change, I think, the way that things are structured. But then on the positive side, there are a number of things that give me hope, I guess, and those things are these. Right now, there's a real strong movement toward an interdisciplinary approach to education and seeing kids as real-life, long-time learners who have a spiritual quest of their own to proceed along. There's a movement against tracking kids into ability levels and to teach in the classroom to create a democratic model. Currently, we're operating under, or trying to operate under now, a set of accreditation standards for the year 2000. I can't remember the buzzword they put on those, but those are very forward-looking accreditation standards. And right now, across the state, whether you're aware of it or not, the teachers are working to produce a curriculum that's much more forward-looking in its scope and what it's trying to do. The downside of that is that all those accreditation standards, because of shrinking funds, have been made in essence non-binding. And that's a real problem, because that means that all that the administrators have to do is say, we need a variance from those accreditation standards, and they'll get the variance, basically. I think that enormous progress has been made in teacher recertification programs where requirements have been upped, and also there has been provided flexibility so that teachers can come to meetings like this and receive credit toward being recertified for doing things like this. And I think that's real beneficial, and it's certainly changed the way that I go about my retraining. I think that on the whole, all the teachers that I've met basically have kids at heart. They aren't just watering at the public trough like we hear. They're very busy and involved with those kids. They're really deeply concerned, and they really do see that kids need time to go on about their own journeys as they grow into young adults. And I really feel like they're working toward those lines. So that's really all I have to say, and I'm going to try to save some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We have about 15 minutes for questions. We invite any question that you may have regarding national, state, educational issues, or even issues that have arisen in your local communities. we'll keep it informal, and we hope to get a lot of participation. Right out here?
This has never been brought up, but one of the things I've often wondered is part of a very mobile population that we are in this country. Has the National Association ever considered any kind of standardization as to what is required? Because so often kids get caught in the cracks of their parents' moves, because in 8th grade this is required here, but in 9th grade it's required back in 6th grade.
Right.
And so the kid winds up having to take summer school or maybe another full year in order to graduate through no fault of his own.
Right. For the benefit of those who may not have heard, the question was posed that given the mobility of the current U.S. population, how indeed that we'll move on average now 5 times in the course of our careers, given that mobility, has the NEA looked at standardizing accreditation or curricular requirements for students on a national level so that students, as they move from one school system to another, might find their way into a school system and meet the expectations in some sort of coherent way as they move from one community to the next. I'll give this one to Judy.
You've raised an excellent point, and the answer is no, and here's why. The 16,000 school districts that we talk about on a nationwide basis are run with an underpinning philosophy that they are, in fact, the purview of the local community. And if you talk to people about, for example, how do they feel about public education? If they feel negative about public education and you come back with the question of, but how do you feel about your school or your child's school? The answer is, I feel pretty good about it. So while we believe that there should be standards, and as a former teacher who dealt with quite a few migrant students, I can tell you that that is a major difficulty as it relates to making sure that the kids all fit in and don't either waste time or have to catch up so much. The fact is that the purview is at the local level. There is one thing, though, that's taking place that will help resolve the problem without what you suggested as the alternative. And those were the national goals that I think Mac and Dennis were talking about. And at this point, with the implementation of the national goals, they do in fact set standards that all schools should attain, which I think will help to integrate the school systems and the learning process better. I'd be happy to pursue that with you. I don't know how other people feel about that, but that is the major reason people don't want that, because they don't assume there is that migration, and they do want to set the standards for their community.
Next question in the back, gentlemen.
I was wondering just a simple definition, working definition of outcome-based education, and why is it such a controversy?
The question asked for a straightforward definition of outcome-based education and a quick assessment as to why that has attracted so much criticism and attention.
I'll give it a shot. I've heard Roy Romer, the governor of Colorado, talk on this topic probably more than anyone else. The fact is the National Education Association does not have a position either for or against outcome-based education. But here is the difference between outcome-based education as a theory and what we currently have in the school system. When we talk about standards in schools today, most state governments, through their state board of education or their legislature, determine what the input to schools should be. That is, class size should be such and such, a library should have so many books based per student, there should be this kind of financial support for each child in the schools. In other words, the standards have been set from the incoming part of education as opposed to the exiting of education. Outcome-based education, as I know it, sets standards for what happens when you've finished all of these things. In Roy Romer's example, Governor Romer's example, he uses the airline pilot as an example, which is what he is, by the way, by trade. He says, when I got ready to be licensed as an airline pilot, I had to pass a series of tests in order to fly the plane. It wasn't, did you take the course on how to fly the plane? It was, can you fly the plane? That's outcome-based education in its purest sense. Here's why it's become a hot potato as it relates to the radical right. When you talk about an airline pilot, those are some pretty obvious kinds of outcomes we're talking about. When you talk about the success of a child, then you're getting into some values issues. So is one of the values, for example, or one of the outcomes, that every child should be tolerant of other cultures and diversities? And if the answer is yes, and that's what you establish as one of the outcomes, then how do you measure it? By what? By not fighting on the playground, by saying I accept all people in my family or whatever. So what has happened, and I think Pennsylvania really is the very best example of a good idea that probably has been shot down, I think, for all intents and purposes. They started with high standards and very definitive outcomes. And because the opposing group took them on so strongly, they started watering everything down. And the more they watered, the muddier it got. To finally, people are saying, so if they do all this, how do we know that they have in fact met these outcome standards? That's sort of a long, complicated answer, but it is not a soundbite answer, unfortunately. It's a fairly complicated process. A lot of states, by the way, and I don't know where your state is on this, but a lot of states are coming up with a combination of both. You should have standards going in. We want so many books, we want licensed teachers, etc., and we want to be able to measure when they come out of school that these children have in fact met a performance standard that will help them to be good citizens.
Another question? Young woman in the back.
As we return to our respective communities and get involved in school board races, what are some of the critical questions we can ask of suspected stealth candidates that bring forward their preconceived notions? Do we ask them about the teaching of creationism, or how do we bring that forward?
The question asks, as we return to our communities and are confronted with local school board elections and the possibility that one of the candidates may be a stealth candidate, if you wish, from the radical right, what questions do we pose and how do we identify these candidates in these local races?
People for the American Way, which is an excellent organization on materials such as this, has a new list. I just was looking at it the other day of 12 questions you would want to ask school board candidates, and I will make certain to get a copy to this group here so that if they're mailing out materials afterwards, or if you want a copy, you can have it. But let me give you a couple of them, and you hit one of them right on target. Where are you on the issue of creationism, which, by the way, now is being taught in the Vista, California school system in San Diego County as a result of this 3-2 school board election that they just had. Another question is, what kinds of groups or organizations or people are you affiliated with? Another excellent question is, do you have children in the public schools? Frequently, these folks who are running for these offices do not and choose not to. What kind of political activity have you been involved in, if any? I think it's good when researching candidates to ask people a series of questions about your background so that you can go to people who are in the groups that they mention and get a personal reference from these individuals. But we'll get the list to you.
Another really good thing to ask people, just ask them if they've been in the schools and in what capacity. Because what we found in our school board races is that oftentimes people have a really jaded view of what goes on in schools, but they've never been in the schools. They have no idea. They haven't attended board meetings. They don't know what the school board discusses. So they're operating out of ignorance, and as you know, ignorance breeds fear and all kinds of other awful things.
As a follow-up on that question too, when Judy sends that list in the American Way, she'll be sending it to me as well. If you wish to get a hold of the MEA in Helena, we can send you a copy of that list. Additionally, for those of you who may have attended Kathy Allen's presentation earlier today, and I think yesterday as well, she identified a number of other techniques for flushing out, if you will, adverse candidates that I found very useful. Kathy would be a good resource on those too. I believe we have time for one more question. And then we have to move on to the next series of sessions. And way in the back.
The religious right is influencing the Christian people in our community to dump all kinds of books and add the kids' curriculum because they may not like one sentence even. They're very extreme. Now what I want to understand is if I join, they're very worried that I even came here. But I don't understand if I join a human rights movement like this. But I've been joining something that takes a strong stand against any form of censorship, a strong stand against any teacher to have the right to discuss things? Or is this type of forum more to bring an open-minded discussion and not a complete attack on it? I don't really know. They're going to be asking me when I come home what would be happening if we let a group like this in our community. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, let me, if I can, briefly respond to that from my perspective. I know over the last 2 years or so, I've had a number of questions posed to me in my office in Helena. People from Fairview calling, people from Ronan, from Pablo, people from Red Lodge, and a number of other communities have called with very specific concerns having to do with curriculum development, textbook censorship, counseling programs, and what have you, that were frankly under attack from what sometimes appeared to be a very local, unorganized effort, but over time became more apparent to me being a somewhat coordinated statewide effort specifically targeting the schools and school employees. My first response was to call Ken Toole and the Human Rights Network. What I have found in doing so is that it's a marvelous resource. It's a group that has resources scattered across the state that's willing to help as those problems arise and have provided very, very useful and practical help in those respects. Also, I think what you'll find is that the help is provided in the ways that you ask it to be provided, that indeed you will not see a prescribed curriculum or specific position statements or what have you coming from the Human Rights Network, or from MEA for that matter. Instead, you will see people and organizational force available to you to assist in the analysis, the research, and the organizing efforts that you need to respond to a local problem at the local level. I've found the Human Rights Network to be a very valuable resource for school employees in the state of Montana. Not sure if another respondent has commented on that.
Just one comment. I was fortunate because the president of the Montana Education Association sent me about this much material on all the activity around this conference before I came here, so I could sort of have a sense of the group and the problems attached to it. And maybe it's because of what it is I taught, but I will have to tell you that I think the best way that you deal with these kinds of problems is to be very firm in what it is you do believe. If you go back to just a very elementary concept, and you look at kids on a playground, who do the bullies pick on? The kids who don't stand up for themselves. I'm truly impressed that you all have come to this conference, because I think this was tough. And I think hanging together and being firm and committed in what it is you believe in, that everybody has the chance to participate in the decision making around the schools or any form of government is really what makes this system that we have work. So, you're terrific.
One of the things that is pervasive in Montana because of the Montana School Board Association, which is really well organized, is that almost every board policy, at least all the ones that I've ever seen, right at the very front, very opening pages, first 2 or 3 pages will have a philosophy. And if you go to that philosophy, it usually gives you some real nice ammunition that you can use against censorship and for academic freedom, because it starts out with, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and it builds on that. And if you aren't aware of that, you might want to look at that and see what it says.
Well, thank you for attending this presentation, and a special thank you to Dennis Carlson, Max Swan, and Judy Behnke.
You mentioned Colorado and Oregon quite a bit in this voucher program. Those are also the 2 states that have the anti-gay ballot initiative. I was wondering what you see as the connection, if we could expect to see both of those at the same time as well.
Yes, there definitely is a connection, because it's the basic connection of people who have an interest that is fairly narrow, that is narrow in scope. And so if you look, for example, to California, all the press clippings, things that are going on right now, Christian Coalition and Pat Robertson are out there actively working on this Proposition 174. And it is incorrect to believe that the radical right is a monolith, because it is not. But it is correct to believe that it is tightly aligned by its values and its principles of placing religion in government places. And anything that relates to those set of values in anything that they do is a violation of values, there is that interconnected group, as there is in our group as well. I mean, we have people of like minds who join together on various causes. That's what makes the democratic system work.
Thank you. To move on with the program for the rest of the afternoon, the 4 workshops we're going to run at 3 o'clock are the 4 that are listed in your program, so I'll just give you the location of those. P-Flag is out of the closet. That's parents and friends of lesbians and gays. They'll be talking about their experiences and about their